Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the College of Engineering Faculty Lecture Series. The 2024 College of Engineering Faculty Lecture Series features lectures by faculty members leading groundbreaking clean water research in the areas of wastewater recycling, desalination, mineral extraction, water quality management, and more. Today's lecture is titled Groundwater Resilience and Agriculture Competitiveness in Ocean Through Climate Adaptive Multibeneficial Managed Aquifer Recharge. The lecture will be presented by Salini Sasidharan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Biological and Ecological Engineering. My name is Leslie Rojas, and I am a student in the College of Engineering, and I will be today's event moderator. We encourage you to submit questions through the lecture using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. A recording of the lecture with captions will be provided to all audience members after the event. If you need assistance at any point during today's event, please put it in a private chat to the host and moderators. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Adam Ward, Department Head of Biological and Ecological Engineering.
I'm pleased to introduce today's faculty speaker, Dr. Salini Sasidharan. Shalini's interests lie in groundwater quantity and quality management, sustainable irrigated agriculture, and resilient urban and rural water resource infrastructure. Her research focuses on the challenges of managed aquifer recharge, including vadose zone monitoring, water quantity and quality, engineering designs for infrastructure, modeling of flow and contaminant transport, and the regulatory standards required for sustainable groundwater management. Salini was the first to evaluate the performance of a vadose zone infiltration system, commonly called a Drywell, and has advocated for its use as a potential managed aquifer recharge technique. This mitigates urban flooding and recharges the groundwater table. Salini, thanks for joining us today. I'll turn things over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this Clean Water Initiative. Thank you for the College of Engineering for inviting me to this very exciting day. So today I am hoping to present my research over the last few years on the use of multi-beneficial managed aquifer recharge and how to achieve the groundwater resilience and agricultural competitiveness across Oregon, as well as some of my past work in California. Of course, this research is a huge collaborative effort with my team at the Oregon State University, my team of postdocs, as well as my current graduate students, as well as undergraduate student in my lab, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Quantity and Quality Innovation Lab, but also a array of collaborators across the country, especially from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Davis, UC Riverside, UC Davis, as well as many other organizations. Also various state departments such as the ODA, Oregon Water Resource Department, DEQ, as funding agencies, as well as regulatory collaborators, and many consultancy firms like Geosystem Analysis, Geospatial, Imaging Partners, Storm Resources, such as industry partners. So this is a great showcase of a very collaborative stakeholder engaged research project. Climate change, whether we agree that on a anthropogenic driven or a natural climate change, the consequences of climate change such as drought, extreme precipitation, flooding, or declining snowpack, and many other challenges are very visible across the planet. And both Oregon as well as California are not behind on the scene, especially if you look into the drought over the last few years. We can see that in many parts of the Oregon, we are seeing ongoing or intermittent drought issues, especially that's coming from the Central Valley regions of California, despite the very wet weeks that we've been having here in Oregon. So groundwater is an integral source of water resources across the planet. And despite its use, probably 70% of the groundwater being used for domestic, industry, irrigated agriculture, thermal energy, and many, many other industries. But because they are invisible, they are below our Earth's surface, these groundwater resources, these very precious water resources being mismanaged over many, many many decades, not just here in the United States, but across the world. And that led to the depletion of these groundwater resources in the planet. Up until probably only in 2022, during the World Water Day, the United Nations made a slogan to create a visibility for the groundwater, which is groundwater making the invisible visible. And this campaign has actually made a lot of momentum within the groundwater sustainability arena across the world, especially for the public perception through educational activities and outreach to make awareness of the groundwater and its importance of conservation and sustainability. And I have joined OSU as an assistant professor, as well as a sustainable groundwater management engineer, which is my fancy title, and I'm always excited about it. So I joined OSU also in 2022. So this gave me a huge mileage and excitement and hope that I'm in the right time at the right place to work towards groundwater sustainability. So when we think about the groundwater management, Oregon is unfortunately also have a lot of concerns over our groundwater resources. So in Oregon, we have two different managed area. One is the Oregon Groundwater Management Area, and also known as GWAMA. And also, other hand, we have Oregon Critical Restricted Area, which are the groundwater depleted area. So groundwater management area, we have three of them. One in the eastern Oregon called Lower Umatilla Groundwater Management Area, or LUBGWAMA. We have one in the North Willamette Valley region, and then one in the Mulhue region. And these three regions were primarily declared as GWAMA because of the very high nitrate concentration contaminating the groundwater, which is a potential carcinogen and can cause blue baby syndrome in babies. So that's been declared as a GWAMA because of the drinking water concerns. On the right-hand side, we can see the distribution of groundwater restricted area. And these are aquifers that are depleted with the groundwater usage and can lead to many dependent ecosystems or irrigated agriculture or even domestic wells that are depending on this aquifer have no additional water sources. And so especially when we think about the water quality, it can be both political, economical challenges too. And this is an example of the Lower Umatilla Groundwater Management Area, or LUBGWAMA, where the nitrate contamination led to statewide challenges, including fines of many contributors as well as political storms. And when we think about the contributors of the contamination, this lead to various sources such as irrigated land application of wastewater, CAFOs, and even rural and open green spaces. On the other side, when we think about the water users, and we have a very economically diverse, culturally diverse water users in our state. And I'm using here just Eastern Oregon as an example. And so in those regions, we have, of course, domestic water, irrigated agriculture, hydropower. Actually, the second largest hydropower in the state after Washington is Oregon. We have a lot of food processing and dairy and livestock operations that depend on groundwater. We also have newer water users that come into the region, such as data centers. Data centers are huge systems where we use the clouds and servers, and they also require cooling water for their system, and they are now depending on groundwater or surface water for those cooling systems. And we also have our aquatic resources and fish populations that require clean water and cold water during this summer season for them to spawn and produce babies. And then, of course, drinking water. So there is a variety of water users in a very water constrained area, both in terms of water quality need as well as water quantity needs. And so therefore, when we think about engineering solutions and sustainability solution, often we either just think about quantity or just quality, but this is where we need to think about multi-beneficial solutions. And so my title suggested multi-beneficial managed aquifer recharge, and that's just showcase that sometimes the solutions has to be focused on multi-users, not just one solution, so that it can be more publicly receiving, publicly acceptable. We can also have more investors because there is multi-benefit into those solutions. So when we think about the regulatory side of the water resource management in West, I'm primarily taking examples from California and Oregon. So in California, again, in Central Valley region, because of the huge water usage, the groundwater being heavily depleted, and they have created this law, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act back in 2014, or known as SIGMA. And this particular, after the formation of the SIGMA, there is a huge influence or effort to manage the groundwater resources in the region. And here in Oregon in 2017, the state has created this integrated water resource strategy, again focusing on both surface water, groundwater management as well. So this today's lecture will be primarily focusing on recharge. And so the big question is, why do we have to recharge the aquifers? So when we think about the groundwater, right? So often the surface water, such as lakes and rivers, they get yearly precipitation or snowmelt, etc. And of course, we know that climate change is declining those patterns too. And often the groundwater is usually recharged by precipitation, either through yearly cycles, or it could be through millennials of cycle. But unfortunately, since we already see the pattern of water users depending on this groundwater, a lot of water being pumped out of this finite resource, then it can be naturally recharged by precipitations and other natural recharge mechanisms. So same like our phone batteries or our car batteries, we need to recharge those batteries to continue to be able to use them, right? So if you don't recharge those systems, we're going to lose their efficiency over the time. So that's why we have to recharge the aquifers in artificial way, so we can still use those resources when the need comes in. And so the term managed aquifer recharge or artificial recharge, there are underground storage or bank storage, all these different terms, depending upon which country or which state you are coming from, they all basically refer to the artificial collection of any type of water putting into an aquifer for later use. And so we call it managed aquifer recharge. And so that's why MAR is a huge integral component on this 21st century. So the managed aquifer recharge or MAR can be achieved through various strategies. So here I'm just showing a snapshot of the very commonly used technologies. So the left-hand side, we have the UGG or flat MAR, which is now very popular in the Central Valley region in California. So of course, we have huge agricultural field, but when we think about the water availability, they may be only available a certain time of the year or a certain time of several year period, maybe once in 2 years or 3 years. So when we think about farmers in agriculture, the farmers may not be very open to building a huge infrastructure waiting there for water to come in and recharge, which is the land is a huge commodity. So there is this idea that came in, why don't we actually flood the agricultural field when we can have excess water and recharge those systems. So this is a great idea. However, there are some challenges, of course, because you could potentially migrate pesticides and herbicides and nitrate from the agricultural field. And if you don't recharge in a very good infiltration rate, you can have water logging in the crops and you can lose the yield of the plants too. So there are pros and cons for this technique. The other common technique is called the aquifer storage and recovery, or the ASR technique, where you basically inject the water directly into an aquifer. So since you're pushing the water straight into the aquifer, it is one of the most regulatory constrained technology. You need to meet the water quality of your groundwater for your pre-injection. So often that means chlorination or reverse osmosis or many expensive engineered pre-treatment technologies to do the ASR operation. So again, it is a great technology, but maybe mostly ideal for industry scale operation than when we think about a small scale farmer or a producer. Another popular technique is the infiltration basin. It's basically a huge empty basin or like a pond structure. It could be as small as 10 by 10 by feet to something like large as in the figure. So it is very commonly used, maybe one of the widely used technology across the world for MAR. Now the challenge with the infiltration basin is again the land. When we think about urban area or an agricultural field, land is an expensive commodity, so we don't want it to dedicate a huge land space for this type of infiltration basin system. And also you can have evaporation of the water because it's open to the atmosphere. And so this is where something that I've been heavily focused over the last 7 years came in, something called Drywell. And so the Drywells are basically a best management practice that been used widely in urban area, especially like parking lots or paved areas where you have the storm and rainwater. So these systems can capture the water and do the infiltration. So we thought about why don't we use these systems in an agricultural context, and I will explain why in a second. So these wide array of managed aquifer recharge technique can provide us, regardless of which technology that we may use, it can provide a lot of benefits, such as, of course, groundwater management and securing water supply, but also helping to maybe limit the pollution in the groundwater by providing dilution effect. By adding clean water into a contaminated groundwater aquifer, we can mitigate saltwater intrusion in the coastal aquifer area by creating a hydraulic barrier. One of the huge problems is we're losing groundwater stream interactions or exchange in many part of the state, which is an integral part of our ecological sustainability. We can recreate those connections. So it often an array of benefit for your purposes. And so this is again showing multi-beneficial rather than a single benefit-focused system. And so, as I mentioned, in 2022, UN recognized groundwater, making the invisible visible, but also they have recognized managed aquifer recharge for the first time. So in collaboration with the International Association for Hydrogeologists, they have demonstrated 28 case studies from 17 low to high income countries that we can implement MAR as a sustainable technology going forward. And they have even acknowledged that actually the most economically and feasible technique to mitigate the groundwater problem is actually managed aquifer recharge. So again, a huge international recognition for this natural inbuilt engineering technique. Now, when we think about managed aquifer recharge, the same question, okay, it's still water, right? Because most of our surface water, such as lake water, river water, is super over allocated. There is no additional water available. So where do you go for still water to do this recharge? So we have to think about alternative water sources. So this could be like a flood water. When you have excess flood water coming in before it gets to the ocean, can we store them over here? Sometimes you have reservoirs over the capacity. Again, those being released going back to the ocean. Can we actually collect them? There are non-traditional ways such as mining or desalinated water or treated wastewater that we can also use as a source water. And so one of the great examples that I wanted to show today is the extreme precipitation and flooding event that's been as a result of the climate change happening. And so these atmospheric rivers that are now very common in the West Coast, especially in our California and Oregon coastal region, that having this huge precipitation coming in a short period of time, causing a lot of flooding issue that we have seen in the early 2023 in California. At that time, they have about 40 atmospheric river came in just within a 2-year period in California that basically made all the dams in the region overflowing. And so those water being flooded through many, many rivers, and the governor in the state has actually declared like an executive order where whoever wants to collect this water to do the recharge can be doing that. And so again, this is, but of course we need to have infrastructure ready to be receiving this water. So why I'm interested in the water ozone infiltration system? So of course, the other technologies have a lot of pros and cons. And so the Drywells, the first advantage is do not require a large installation area. It is a 6 feet diameter system, but can be drilled up to 120 to 150 feet, depending upon your local soil properties. It can be buried underground. So you can technically do this in an agricultural field without prohibiting any ag operation. So very attractive to farmers. As you can see in the picture, most of their surface area extend vertically or horizontally under the ground, so there is no evaporative loss of this water. And since we are only delivering the water within the unsaturated zone, or also known as the WADO zone, we still gain the opportunity to remove any potential contamination through the transport through the natural soil. So again, Mother Nature helping us to remove those contaminants, then we putting those water directly into the aquifer. And now these systems are, everything is point source. We have a inlet, so we can also implement some pre-treatment strategies locally before the water enters the system, especially if we are using alternate water sources such as treated wastewater. So a majority of my work when I started, we used numerical models such as the Hydrus 2D 3D, which is a water flow software that solves the recharge equation for water flow to kind of like understand how the water moves through the subsurface or through the soil from a Drywell. So we can kind of predict how fast the water would get into the water table. If you have a specific contaminant of interest such as viruses in your source water, how many days it will take for that water to get into the water table. So what should be the separation distance? So a lot of those work I've been doing in the past 5 years through numerical model. The first project was actually in collaborations with the US EPA and US Army at Fort Irwin in California. This is a Army basin in the middle of Mojave Desert. So in summer month, it's a very dry condition. In winter month, they can get this flash flood from monsoon. And of course, they have a catchment basin, right? You can see in the figure. And this water used to stay there for 3-4 months with a very minimal infiltration. So we went in and installed a Drywell within this basin. Now that water can be infiltrated in less than 2 days. And also the water table can be recharged through capturing in the middle of desert where water availability is very, very minimal, but every drop can be recycled back into the aquifer. So this was our first project. Followed by the success of this project, we wanted to compare the performance of this Drywell system through an infiltration basin. So this is a numerical model that I have performed, comparing the performance of one Drywell with a 70-meter diameter infiltration basin, which is almost equivalent to a football field. So you can see the size of that infiltration basin. And so our model demonstrated that actually 5 Drywells can infiltrate same volume as a 70-meter diameter infiltration basin. So of course that's a model. How can we do this in the field and prove that? So I was fortunate enough to receive a funding from the US Department of Agriculture back in 2020 to try this idea in an actual agricultural field. So this is located in Fresno, California. On the left-hand side of the highway, it is an agmar field where they flood the water into an agricultural field. On the right-hand side, we installed 5 Drywells separated by 100 meter based on the model. And there is a canal that you can see that they divert the water from Kings River if there is a flood that happens. You can see the footprint because this is a research site. I have kept the height of the Drywell a couple of feet above the soil surface so we can access the system, but you can see that the footprint is very minimal. Of course, you can bury this under the ground if it is not a research site. But whenever I go to the field, there are carrots and garlic growing around it, so I don't see the farmer has any problem with the operation of their field. On the bottom figure, you can see something called a monitoring well. So this is basically a well that goes to all the way 250 feet. That's where the groundwater table at this location. But we also equip this well with the sensors in between to track how the water moves through the system. So it has a water content sensor, a metric potential sensor that can measure when the water arrives at different steps. So again, this is to think about not just water quantity, but also water quality. We have suction lysimeters that we can collect the water sample in between and do analysis for water quality. So during the installation, we also collected soil samples from all these different 5 systems and do some lab-based analysis such as moisture content, EC, hydraulic properties, so we can really understand whether the system, the soil, is homogeneous or is heterogeneous. So the figure on the left-hand side just shows these color patterns, and these are all different soil properties. So you would assume in a 500-meter area, all the soil should be similar, but this is more like a layered cake. If you take like one of those rainbow cake or red velvet cake, you cut them, you can see different layers, and sometimes those layers are not continuous, and it has a huge impact how the water moves through that layers and how they spread through the system. So that is one of my huge interests, because whenever you choose a site for recharge, you need to identify where exactly you put those systems, because in this case this is an agricultural area, but it could be that a more residential sort of area. So if you let the water go through the horizontally, it can get to somebody's basement, right? So that's going to create another problem. So you have to be careful where you implement this system, creating not additional problems as well. So this is actually a practical an opportunity that we have received back in 2023 as followed by that huge atmospheric river event. So the Pine Flat Dam upstream to the Fresno site been overfilled by beyond its capacity, I think after 12 years also. So December 2022, you can see the canal pretty empty, and January 2023, we received the flood water. So of course, the biggest challenge for the source water is the turbidity. You can see that it's pretty dirty in a way, a lot of clay present in that water. So of course the big challenge would be if you put in a lot of water with the clay, that would clog the system and that will completely destroy our engineering system. So the site itself has a mesh gate at the entry of the canal that would intercept and remove large debris. But we are primarily talking about clay particles such as less than 1 micron size. So we put in a geotextile membrane at the intake pipe so that it can minimize those clay particles. Now again, the challenge is to have a system that can continuously operate without even clogging this geotextile membrane. On the right hand figure, I have the turbidity concentrations within these 5 Drywells that we have different sensors capturing the concentration of incoming water. As we can see at the beginning of the infiltration, there is a huge flux of contaminants, so it's not contaminant, like colloidal particles and clay that was coming in, and then we had to optimize our geotextile membrane multiple times. We tried some different designs and we managed to get into less than 200 NTU. Ideally we wanted to be 1 NTU, almost drinking water standard. So currently I have a postdoc, Dr. Aravind Egambaram, working on developing some zero energy, zero waste pre-treatment technology that we can implement at this site, hopefully next year before the storm comes in. So this is the deep water ozone monitoring system that I have mentioning. So this is during the installation, we put these sensors into the same soil that we have collected at that different depth. So we would understand what is going on at specific depth of where the sensors are kept. So this is the data that we've been collecting. Everything is live in the cloud. We can see the water movement in live. So I'm just showing you the data from the last year. As we can see, there are 4 depths ranging from 13.55 meter all the way to 44.65 meter. So it's basically the flush right here is the event that we started with all the flooding. As we can see that the deeper sensor received water right after almost 6 months, we started the actual injection. 3 months after the injection period. So this again shows that how the water moving through those layers over the time. On the right hand side, we also have a metric potential sensor, which is also measuring the pressure variability, which is a function of the water content in the region as well. So some of the additional analysis that we are doing is comparing this data with the time-lapse ERT geophysics, which I'm not showing here, but it's again comparing different tools, integrating different tools to really capture what's going on in the field. And so we have observed some variability in the predicted time that would be coming through the ERT versus sensors. And so there is some additional research is needed to understand how well the sensors are performing versus a geophysical tool. We also have EC measurement. So this basically would measure, if you have like any salt leaching happening and etc. And I mentioned we also have water sample collection happening at different depth. And unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of arsenic, uranium, etc. within the soil, which is very common in type of the clay material that you see in California. And that's exactly was the purpose of doing those sensors, because we don't want it to create a problem by solving a problem, right? We try to solve the water quantity problem, and we don't want it to definitely create a water quality problem. We are also looking into temperature as the water moves through the system. And so the additional research is looking to see if we can use the temperature as a potential tracer for tracking the recharge in the aquifer. So eventually the goal for the research is integrate all this information that I have collected from the physical field and integrate that into the Hydros 2D 3D model and see that how well we can characterize the subsurface and then eventually predict the recharge time and arrival time, how much water can be actually reach into the groundwater. Because there is a perception that every water droplet that leaves the root zone is recharged. It may recharge, but it would take 1,000,000 years or it could be taken day, right? Depending upon which location you are looking into. So just because we put in some water into the field doesn't mean that that water actually arrived the water table. And so this model that will help us to identify that, how, if we recharge today, when is that water is ready to be recovered? And those kind of predictions and establishment is important from a regulatory standpoint because this is an investment with return, and when that return would be available for the farmer or other stakeholder investors. So we also looked into some additional design concepts. So of course the Drywells are not a cheap installation system, and typically that's because it's made for a suburban or urban area. So we are looking into different designs that we can cut down the cost and can implement this system in agricultural fields. So we also shows the diameter of this Drywell is one of the cost component because it's required different drilling technology. And we've seen that even by reducing the sizes up to 20 centimeter, you can still gain 50% efficiency of the recharge, but in a much cheaper cost. Some additional thoughts that we were having is, we have a huge networks of canal system across California, Oregon, and many other states. And so the biggest challenge for a farmer is always putting this system. How do you bring the water from the canal or from a river into their field? So if we can actually use the canal system by working closely with the irrigation district and implement these system within the canal itself, and of course we can control when the system will be turned on and turned off. When the farmers need water, we turn it off. When they don't need the water, we can turn it on and recharge. And just by doing some example case studies in Merced, California, we demonstrate that we can almost recharge more than 600,000 water just by their 723 miles of canal system. Some additional engineering idea that we also have a lot of wells that gone dried. For example, just alone in Fresno area, we have more than 10,000 wells that dried. And so why don't we repurpose these wells for recharge? Because we already know that those wells are situated in a very conductive area. So if we can repurpose that for recharge, then that would really reduce the cost of putting these wells, but also we already know that it is in a good location for recharge. But these are more like ideas that we are trying to explore now with the different regulatory agencies and irrigation district right now. So this is just showing a conceptual model of how different type of Drywell system can be implemented. So these are all the work that I have done in California. So when I moved into Oregon back in 2022, so I was part of the water cluster here. We were 4 faculties looking into irrigation, water quality, toxicology, and groundwater. And so we together formed this initiative called Oregon Water Initiative, and fortunate to be funded through the College of Agricultural Sciences to develop a system-level collaborative solution. And through this project, we wanted to create a single field where we can look into irrigation, soil-water interactions, water contaminant and toxicology, as well as the water ozone and groundwater. So as part of this Oregon Water Initiative, my part of the research is to develop a Managed Aquifer Recharge innovation field site. So this is more like my dream project, to have a site here in Oregon, here at the OSU campus, where we can use this site as a extension, education, research site where this type of lecture, after the lecture, we can take people to the field and they can actually see that how the implementation and how the data would look like, so they can go into the actual practitioner's perspective and actually do an implementation. So this is a conceptual diagram of the system that I'm building. It has infiltration basin, different type of Drywell. We have an array of water ozone and monitoring well network, but it is all in a half-acre plot. So the cool thing about this field is it's a very controlled a very small area to manage. So we can really study, control, experiment, and really understand the fundamental processes, versus the California project is an actual practical location. So there are a lot of constraints on when the water comes, how to access the data, how we can control various experiments. So we, of course, when we start a project like Managed Aquifer Recharge, the first question is this location is even practical? So we done some initial studies on using pre-existing information. So we looked into the well information, the groundwater well information in the region. And so this is a part of the Willamette Valley Research and Extension Center, part of OSU campus. This is where the Willamette River is. On the north side of the river, we have more basalt well. On the south side, we have more alluvial well. So we basically looked into only the alluvial aquifer. That's why our primary interest in this research, because basalt aquifer can only do possibly ASR type of MAR project. However, this area was actually a groundwater critical area. So it already have a huge depletion problem, almost 2 feet per year in many of those wells. We had very minimal data on the groundwater level in the region, but even using the very small amount of data, we kind of created a kind of a contour map for the water level data for the marsh, which is kind of representing the before irrigation period, and in September after sort of irrigation period, and shows that the water probably moving from south to north and kind of discharging into the Willamette River, which makes sense. But again, it shows that we faced a lot of challenges because there were not many data points available, but we are also showing that with the very minimal data, what you can still do before you actually go to the field to invest actually ground truthing additional information. We also try to do some subsurface heterogeneity, try to understand the layering of the region by looking into different wells and the well log data, and kind of using interpolation technique to see what would be the three-dimensional subsurface heterogeneity would look like in this location using Rockware software. So again, it's not the perfect, but it still provides us some enough understanding of the soil properties and what to expect in that field. So again, showing that before you actually going into confirming a location, we did some preliminary studies to confirm that this site can be useful. And actually, we did this exercise through multiple sites for Oregon. It took me almost a year to find the location where I want to do this implementation. So because we don't want it to fail once you start the project. And so it again shows a roadmap to implementation of the Drywells. So once we've done that part, we wanted to collect additional data. So I'm trying to integrate geophysical tools into my research. I'm not a geophysicist at all, but I'm trying to integrate, again, multidisciplinary approach into my research. So this is called TTM or TOTEM, so Transient Electromagnetic Survey. And so this is receiver coil. It can be towed into a ATV. So you have like a coil that sends a specific electric current into the ground, and it do as a pulsar. So every time it stops, that electric current will return back into the surface, and it will be collected through a receiver coil. And based on your soil property, the electric current can either move fast or it is resistant, because, for example, clay with a lot of water, the electric current can pass through it much faster, versus sand and gravel, it takes a lot of time for that, so it has more resistivity. So we basically done this TTM survey in the entire field. So this is the study site, and then we have actually collected data for the nearby field. Now, this is a great technique. Now, some of the difficulties of this particular technique is that it is highly influenced by electrical lines or metal fences around the study site. So of course we have a metal fence around right here the field. We have electric line going across the field. We have a lot of irrigation lines that are iron that was actually disturbing this data. But again, we collected data from the nearby field and sort of again interpolating what might be the geological features of this site. So this is a slice of data from the top 0 to 5 meter, then 5 to 10, and 10 to 15 meter. In the top area, we can see that it's more less resistive soil. So that shows that it probably more clay, silty material. Then we are transitioning to more resistant material, which is more like sand, gravel material. And then as we go even deeper, we can see more and more resistance. So again, it shows a layered system in the in the region. And this is again a key tool because you need to understand what type of MAR technology would be useful. So this technique shows that maybe infiltration basin is not a great tool in here because you have more like a silty, clayish material for the top 5 meter, but maybe Drywell is a more better technology because you can bypass those top layers by putting the water into maybe 10 meter rather than putting into the top 1 meter. So the second challenge when I think about a MAR is, of course, water. And so we are coming to the North Willamette Valley Research and Extension Center. There is no lake or river next to me that I can collect water. So how do I have to be really creative in here? So the first source of water that we will be using is the groundwater itself. I'm going through a water right permission process right now because the thinking process there was this is not going to be a recovery site. This is more like a research site where we want to inject the water and understand how the water moves. So for that purpose, we can use the groundwater, pump it back into the system, contaminating any system. But I also wanted to make sure that I have a demonstration of the real managed aquifer recharge. So fortunately, we also have an agrivoltaic farm, also by the Dr. Chad Higgin from the Department of Biological and Ecological Engineering. We have this huge agrivoltaic system at the same location, hundreds of panels looking into integrated agriculture and energy nexus. So I thought, why don't we put in gutters into this solar panel and collect the water from these gutters, and then we will divert that water into the recharge site and then use that as a recharge. Especially in the valley region, we get a lot of rain and we do not need any permit to use those surface water. So that's going to be our secondary water source for this location. So again, connecting that water energy food nexus cycle by showing a Drywell MAR integrated with the agrivoltaic system. So we recently received a small funding from Agricultural Foundation, and 2 undergraduate students are working on developing the gutter designs for the solar panel. So this is just showing a quick demonstration of the actual field installation of the Drywell. So we have a pre-treatment well where we can implement different type of pre-treatment ideas on how to treat the water. And then this is going to be the actual Drywell. This is about 40 feet in depth, and this is about 15 feet in depth. So again, having a site to test these different hypotheses at the same location. So now I quickly want to see, I mentioned about the sensors and their variability. So, not just in groundwater management, but we look into irrigation and in many other field research, sensors are becoming a very huge integral part of research. But we noticed that the sensors has to be very carefully calibrated depending upon the installation technique and also your background soil. Otherwise, it could be having mis data. So we compare the performance of sensors with different installation techniques, such as different silica flour sand mixtures, or they being put in a bag, because we have to put these into 50 feet or 60 feet deeper into the soil. And so based on the data, we immediately realized that there is a huge variability in the data output depending upon the installation. So we decided to take it to a next step and do this in a field sensor testing facility. So we kind of mimicked how a well would look like. So this is more like a small well, just 3 meters in depth, and we put all the sensors into the soil surface without any disturbance, and that's how it's been recommended to be installed. And on the left-hand side, we have put them into different type of bags or different type of bare soil because that's the only way we can install them deep into the subsurface. And the data shows that we have done some infiltration experiment into a pit to mimic a managed aquifer recharge setup, and our data shows that there is a huge difference in there is a huge difference in between different type of installation. A soil sock really underestimate my arrival time and the saturation compared to the sensor that is actually installed in a soil wall. And this was consistent across the 2 different type of sensors that I have tested. So I figured that putting the sensors into a sort of like impermeable bag, or we used cloth bag, and that's not a great idea. So we actually came up with a very novel, exciting idea right now. We're using biodegradable bag to put in these sensors, and we have come up with some methodology to install them. And so that's how I installed the sensors recently into the field. So again, the message here I wanted to mention is that when we use these sensors for field study, not just for groundwater, but any kind of irrigation or any kind of soil moisture sensing, you have to be extremely careful that how much of the error is happening because of poor installation technique or, the soil type. So this is just the location for the field, and we have just recently completed the installation of 4 monitoring wells, which are shown in the green color, and 4 water zone well that goes all the way to 50 feet with an array of sensors. We also have the dry well here and the pre-treatment well here. This is a neighbor's field, but we are really working closely together, and they actually use that for pumping. So we basically going to depend on them as a pumping level, because our wells are just for monitoring purposes, not necessarily for pumping purposes. So again, shows the need of stakeholder engagement. And so this is just the quick, and this just from, really hard from the oven data. I just came back from the field last Monday, so we only completed the installation from April 8 to this last Monday. So this is really crude data. But just to quickly show that, we have collected the soil sample, we done some quick analysis from the field itself, and these wells were only separated by like 10 meters. You can still see how variable, I mean, it's pretty homogeneous, but you can still see variability in the soil property in the field. And we instrumented all the 4 different water zone well with an array of different type of sensors, focused on different type of soil type and different type of infiltration ideas that we will be testing in the future. So the overall goal is to really characterize the subsurface, both using sensors as well as geophysical tools and physical data to understand how the water moves through the system. So it's just some quick pictures. This is an aerial picture of the drilling. We used a sonic drilling, and the reason for that, you can collect intact core during the installation process. So that would help us to understand the soil properties without having any disturbance of the system. And then once we collected the soil sample, we dried them because we want to refill the well with the exactly same soil sample. So it is representative of the exact soil properties of the location. So the sensors are collecting the best data possible, even though it's a disturbed system, but we could do the best in the field. And this is the actual installation of a suction lysimeter and various other sensors. And as I mentioned, we have came up with this new idea of a biodegradable bag that we tested, and it's working, but I still need to connect these sensors into data loggers and everything to start collecting data because it's just still fresh. So the installation is going to continue in this week. This is sort of the final completion of a well. You can see that all the different sensor cables are coming out of the well, and this is a final look into that. So with that, I just wanted to quickly complete this lecture with a roadmap for Drywell Mars. So if you are interested in implementing a Drywell or any other managed aquifer recharge technology, there is 2 major components. The stakeholder engagement. What does that mean is your water right, your land use. So you should be really working closely with the industry partners or farmers and regulatory agency. And I have to really emphasize that, which is I have to go through a lot of regulatory constraints. Often it's because it's invisible, right? So each county to each state have different rules for different ideas. So you need to be really working closely with your agencies to understand what's possible in your district or in your state. And then you also need to have a lot of research. And I would really suggest starting a desktop study using pre-existing information before you go into the actual physical site to collect additional data, because it's a long-term investment. And so once you have all of those information, then that's where you would do the pilot study, which is what exactly that we are doing, having a demonstration, more like a feasibility study, and then you could do a life cycle assessment to understand that what is the return of investment, what is the total budget, so you can think about a long-term operational project. And so this roadmap is still applicable for any managed aquifer recharge ideas that you wanted to implement. So I'm really excited about this location, really looking forward for members of the community, scientists, engineers, stakeholders, and agencies to come and visit us and really learn from us, and also think about really multidisciplinary projects that we can integrate and study. And so it's more like a field lab. So I'm really excited about getting this project on ground finally after 2 years of long way. And I have to really also thank my team, my students and my postdoc. They're really working in the background to get these preparations to get in the field. So really big kudos to them. So with that, I would like to thank the College of Engineering and everyone else for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sasidharan, for sharing your research with us. It was just an incredible congratulations on the installation. It's here in Oregon. It's happening. We're just so excited to learn more and continue. We actually have a couple of questions, so we'll start the Q&A portion of our event. We won't be able to address every question today, but we will get to as many as we can. We'll begin with a question I wrote down during the lecture, which has to do a lot more with the sensors. So I really just want to learn more about it. And specifically, you mentioned that there are, there are new ones that you're using and they're very new to the study. How are you going to gauge the margin error in your sensors in the future and as you continue to do the pilot study?
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the reason that we wanted to test different sensor to sensor variability. So the approach that we have taken is before we actually even deploying these sensors into the field, we done like almost, for example, 20 sensors we had to go into the field. So we tested the individual sensor to sensor variability and how reliable they are. And they're pretty reliable from sensor to sensor. But when it's come down to installation, type of soil, how good contact that you have, that method of installation is that you have to optimize for your technology. And so our goal is to kind of like identify sort of like a standard deviation of moisture content, say an example, and that can be included in my model, because if you just use the actual measured value within the instrumental error, but if you're not acknowledging your installation method error, that could be either over predict or under predict your simulation time. So really my goal is to transfer these data into the simulation. So that's the goal, is to come up with an error margin between the sensors, and the big goal is really how to minimize that. And so that's where we are also really investing on coming up with a new novel way that how we can implement these sensors at 50 or 60 deep depth without compromising their ability to give us an amazing data.
That's incredible. That's so much work. I'm so excited to hear more about it. Our next question is, has there been any specific study or thoughts of application for municipal recycled water to augment aquifers to maintain water supply?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Like I mentioned, municipal wastewater or any recycled wastewater is definitely a source water. Especially in the state of Arizona, they've been using a lot of treated wastewater as a soil, they call it SAT or soil aquifer treatment ideas. Another great example is the Orange County Water District in California, been using it a lot of Oregon and as well as Los Angeles, Orange County Water District as well as Los Angeles City Water as a infiltration basin idea. So one of the reasons I haven't really focused on municipal wastewater yet is definitely the expenses and the infrastructure associated to that, as I mentioned at the beginning, because it's mostly an industrial partnership. But I have a very exciting project. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the data centers are really attracted to Pacific Northwest. So they are huge water users. But at the same time, they also produce sort of wastewater, which is coming through their cooling system. So if you think about the servers, they have these cooling pipes that send the water, but you have like a 30-40% of evaporation. So it's still clean water, but you have some additional TDS, dissolved salt. And so I have a project currently with the data center in Hermiston to use their non-contact wastewater for recharges. So that's my closest to the recycled wastewater. Really excited, and that project is also going to be on ground in September. So that I think that's for the first time in the world, or probably the United States, to be doing a recycled non-contact wastewater from a data center for recharge. So really, really excited about that project.
Congratulations! We'll be looking forward to it in September. Okay, our next question is, have you investigated retention or detention ponds that counties have mandated? I have property where the county has a detention pond that could benefit from a dry well. So this is from a member.
Okay, so I haven't personally don't have an infiltration basin or a detention basin in our field, but like I mentioned, that's going to be implemented, for example, to compare the performance of a dry well and infiltration basin. However, my model and my prior experience with the Fort Irwin, which I would say a huge infiltration basin, the biggest challenge is the clogging issue. So you need to kind of like stop the flow, sort of like, remove all the sediment from top of the retention basin and have to facilitate that infiltration ability. Where the system work better is you can still use the retention pond or the infiltration pond as a holding place for the water, to store the water temporarily, because you need to keep that water, right? Whenever the flood comes, you need to keep the water somewhere. Then you will have a dry well right next to that. And so you will only run that clean water that already have all the sediments gone in for the additional infiltration. So you gain two advantages. You will minimize the clogging problem from the dry well, but then you have a holding facility that you can hold the water. So I think that's a great way. If they are interested, I would be super happy to look into like alternate design and cost-effective design, especially for a home-based property. We probably don't need a 75K worth of dry well system being implemented. So yeah, definitely a great opportunity.
Thank you. Our next question is, when you mentioned zero energy, zero waste technology to remove turbidity in pretreatment, are you talking about anionic treatment?
I'm really talking about mostly filtration technologies. So we are thinking about mostly gravity-fed technologies. Like I mentioned, my Drywell systems in Fresno, California, everything is under gravity. So we have systems created in slope, so the water can move through the pipelines into the groundwater. So we're thinking about a huge sand filtration unit, maybe natural soil or a combination of gravel, sand, as well as natural soil to treat the water. So that way it's all zero energy. There is no pumping happening. Everything is gravity fed, everything through natural filtration. And the zero waste is meant often by reverse osmosis or other engineering pretreatment technology. The big question is, you have the wastewater that passed through the filtration system that has to be thrown somewhere. And then now we have regulations on PFAS and other contaminant. So that's a question. Okay, you have a waste that need to be treated. So from a farmer's context, how that can be possible. So we again thinking that running through the system, through a sand filtration type of unit, there is no wastewater coming out of it. Of course, you need to have maintenance of your filtration unit, but through a sequence of measuring treatment, you can eliminate any wastewater coming through the system. So it's all, I would say, sand or other filtration technique than other anionic or cationic treatment.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is, how is passive management of seawater intrusion accomplished?
Yeah, great. So usually it's through a hydraulic barrier formation. So if you have like a Drywell system or a Managed Aquifer Recharge, you're usually putting in much cleaner water. So the density difference between your clean, fresh water versus your saline water is kind of creating the hydraulic barrier, right? So often why the coastal aquifers have, first of all, seawater intrusion is because we pumped out all the groundwater from those aquifers. So now the salt water is intruding into your groundwater. So if you can maintain that hydraulic barrier by keeping a Managed Aquifer Recharge, and of course you have to maintain the pumping rate to keep that hydraulic barrier, then you can keep the seawater away from getting into the groundwater. And there are some great success stories in Australia and many other parts of the world. MAR is solely used for just to mitigate the groundwater intrusion. And I think there are some projects in Florida as well that's going on right now.
Wow. Okay. We have time for one final question, and it is, are you planning to develop a groundwater model or staturized zone to access the effect of the Drywells on aquifer reserves? And in that note, also, are you planning to showcase your research sometime soon?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. Yes, the groundwater flow model is already underway. So the figure that I have showed, that is going to be a coupled unsaturated and saturated zone model. So we will be thinking about coupling HydroStudy 3D as well as mode flow to study the influence of Drywells and how the recharge would influence into the groundwater. So yes, it's already underway. Hopefully the paper will be out in this year, end of this year. And then in terms of showcasing, yes, so the site is still under development. Like I mentioned, we just completed the installation part. All these sensors has to be connected to the data logger and start receiving the data. But the goal is definitely to have a location where we will have more like a touring. So after this lecture, we can go into the field and everyone can come and see and ask more like physical question, or even having a collaboration. So it's definitely, it will be open to public and anyone interested, but I'm hoping that would be happening in late summer this year. At least part of it. It's a phase process. So we are in phase 3 right now, I think. Yeah.
That's so exciting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you for, again, Professor Sasidharan, for that fascinating lecture and for your answers to all the questions. Before we go, do you have any parting comments to share with the audience? Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today in this lecture. I'm really excited about this journey over the last 2 years. So of course I cannot see you, but I'm really hoping to meet some of you again. Maybe reach out to me through the emails that if you have additional questions, if there are opportunity to collaborate either in this project or any other Managed Aquifer Recharge, Groundwater Recharge project across the state, I will be so excited to meet you and talk to you. So thank you again. Thank you to all of you in the audience again for joining us today and for your great questions. As a reminder, we will email you a captioned video recording of the lecture. We also hope you'll join us in a week for our next College of Engineering faculty lecture. You can find a link to the full schedule of all upcoming lectures on the Faculty Lecture Series webpage. Thank you again for attending and have a wonderful afternoon.